Hey everyone, Casey Irvine here, and today I want to talk to you about instruction files for Copilot memory and this cool tool called Chronicle that's in the Copilot CLI and coming to other Copilot surfaces as well. Um, and in my last video, I talked about how we can customize our Copilot or agent experience using agents, skills, hooks, extensions, and all that good stuff. And I think I explicitly mentioned that I'm going to get to instructions and instruction files, and I didn't do that in that video, because I specifically kind of wanted to dive a little bit deeper into some of the other cool things around instructions, because there's a lot of support for it, and go into how I use instruction files and how some other teams at Microsoft use instruction files, and just some of the tools that are built into the Copilot CLI to make that a lot better of an experience, an easier to bootstrap experience, and then also how memory ties into that. So first, let me kind of talk about what instruction files are. And of course, there's documentation on what instruction files are, but I think it's super helpful to look at, especially the VS Code team's repository for how they use instruction files, because this is a very popular, very high traffic open source project. They're killing it over at the VS Code team, and so I like to look at what they're doing as a good example of things to follow. And you can see at this top level directory a lot of the things that I talked about last video: agents, hooks, skills. You can see they have prompts, which is cool, which is something that kind of came around a little bit before even skills and some of these other things. But they have them, and we didn't really talk about them. But maybe we'll do another video on those. But I think they're used maybe less. At least I use them less in my projects. But we can see at the top level here, there's also this Copilot Instructions.md file. Um, and you can kind of see that, like, what they have is they have an overview of the project. They have some layout of what the project looks like. Some core architecture, and really more like where to find information. And I think that's key for what's in your instruction file. But really, this instruction file is for your harness, which is something like the Copilot CLI or Copilot running in VS Code, or even the Copilot Cloud Agent. Um, and it's going to apply this to also the agents that are running in that. So this is kind of information that's going to be spread across all of your agents. And I really like how the VS Code team approaches this. And we'll go into this a little bit more when we talk about repository level instructions. But they don't use this to replace documentation. They use it as sort of a pointer for the agents and for Copilot to be able to find the documentation or find various pieces of the project, and kind of be that initial hint to help it bootstrap into the project. But and this is looking at this repository, but there's another type of instruction file, which is your personal instruction file. And so this goes in your home directory in .copilot, and then you'll have your Copilot instructions. And I want to show what I have in mind, because it can be very small or just little things. And for me, this is like my preference about how I want Copilot CLI to kind of interact with me, or any Copilot. It doesn't have to be the CLI. But how it interacts with me, what its output is like, kind of like how I want to interact and have it work on my projects in general. I might have more specific project instructions at the repository or project level. And then here you can see, like, whenever it's responding for me, I like to say that it annotates itself so that it knows that anyone who sees a response from me, if Copilot's acting on my behalf, that it says that it's an AI, not just me, because a lot of times it does use my permission to respond to different things. And so, this can be as small as just the way that you like it to phrase things. If you want to give it a little bit of personality, if you have a specific language you want it to use, if anything like that, anything that's personal to you, you can have in this Copilot Instructions.md file. And like I mentioned, you can have this at in your personal Copilot directory, and then you can also have them in your repository. What's cool about repository level instructions is there's actually like subfolders in this instructions folder. So this is in .github instructions, and .github Copilot instructions.md is where you'd find these in a repository. And these can be specific instructions based on a path in your repository. So this one doesn't have a path, but it has like a description, which can be a hint in this front matter here to the harness or the agent that's going to look at this, of like when it might want to load the rest of the context of this file. And so again, it's like helping the agent or the Copilot harness manage its context by saying, do I really need to load this whole file? And then in some of these, we'll see there should be, yes, these apply to sections, which is really cool because they can say like, hey, only apply these instructions if you're working in or making changes in this directory. So it's a nice way to say, like, maybe you have a couple different languages that you're working on in your project. You can kind of set conventions for each of those languages in these specific instruction files, or maybe you have a specific build process or a specific test process that you use for certain parts of your project. You can outline that here, or at least point to the documentation. And again, I feel pretty strongly that your instruction files shouldn't replace your repo documentation. You should document your repo for agents, for humans, for anything that might come along. You definitely want to have good documentation, but these instruction files can be really helpful to kind of just give some pointers to your harness or to your agents that maybe it needs help discovering that documentation. I think you'll see here that no, this one is pretty lengthy, but they're not crazy lengthy, and there maybe is some documentation like things. I saw some interfaces sort of listed here, but it's really meant to just be hints to your agents to be able to get it right when working in these folders, and I think that's pretty powerful. But of course, we're not just going to stare at files in a repository. We're going to launch Copilot CLI, and I have my fork of VS Code here. So let's go ahead and launch that. And I'll show you that, of course, Copilot CLI has some awesome built-in commands to help you with instructions. So let me enlarge this a little bit just in case you guys need to see it. So there's an /instructions command. And so since I'm in the VS Code repository, real quick, I want to just point out how it's cool that when it does loading environment, it kind of shows you almost all the things that I've talked about so far with customizing Copilot. So you can see my 4 agents, my plugin. We didn't talk about MCPs, although that's not necessarily about customization. It's more things that Copilot can do. Your skills, hooks, extensions, and then custom instructions is sort of what we're talking about now. So I have this /instructions command, and this will show me at the different levels what instructions I have. So it picked up my home Copilot instructions here, and I could even toggle this on and off if maybe I wanted to like not apply that to this session for some reason. It shows me what's at the repository level. So here's my GitHub Copilot instructions in the repository. This is the VS Code repository. There's also an agents MD file, which is like an emerging standard for any agents that are working in this repository, maybe some guidelines for them and what they're going to do. Very similar to Copilot instructions, but it's a little bit more portable too, because there's some other harnesses that will look at this and honor it. And then here's all those sort of sub instructions that I talked about that exist as well. And you can sort of toggle all of these on and off if for some reason you wanted to not have your harness or not have your agent look at these. So of course, there's a nice view of this in the Copilot CLI. And I'm not going to launch the agents app from VS Code right now, but there's also an instructions section in that app as well if you're using that for your UI versus using the CLI. All very cool stuff. But let's say I have a brand new repository, and in fact, I'm just going to launch a new tab here. And I, want to start using instruction files, but I, don't want to go look up the documentation. I want just kind of a quick, easy way to initialize that. So let me go ahead and make a new project here. Yeah, I already did some of it. Okay. Oh, actually, let me remove the new project, and I'll make another one. There we go. And then now I can do it. There we go. New project. And so maybe I just go ahead and git initialize this just so it's a Git repository. I don't have to do that, but then I'm going to launch Copilot CLI here. Oops. There we go. That's the one I wanted, right? No. Stream on. There we go. 2 dashes. Okay, cool. So brand new repository, nothing in it. You can see that it's still loading some things that I have outside this repository, right? That are my personal, my personal agents, plugins, things like that. And you can notice that like there was definitely more. Oh, it went away. But there was 4 agents here. So if I do /agent, we can see that there's more agents here. But if I go here, it just loaded the personal agent that I have, which is my DevBox optimization one that I talked about last video. So we won't get into depth of that, but I just want to show that, it's picking up these things depending on the context that I'm in, depending on the which repository I'm in. It's only picking up my personal ones right now because this is a totally empty repository. But if I do /init, this command will initialize Copilot instructions for this repository. And this is an empty repository, but if you had stuff in this repo, if you had some things, you can see that it's thinking. It would do some analysis on your repository to initialize that instruction file. And in fact, I wonder if okay, I better not do that. But I was gonna say, maybe I have a repository that doesn't have an instruction file that I could show this off with. I actually don't think I have one. I think I have instruction files in all my repos. But this is pretty cool if you want to bootstrap your repository with like a sane set of instruction files. This is a cool way to do it, and that's gonna get you up and running. So the next thing I want to talk about while this is doing this is a little bit of a sidebar, but I promise it's going to make sense when I get done talking about it. But it's about memory and agentic memory. And there's been a lot of talk about memory. I say a lot, but there's definitely some conversations around memory and how agents should use memory. And way back last year, 6 months ago, 7 months ago, before we knew a lot about agents, or at least maybe I didn't know a lot about agents, and we were still kind of using edit mode and VS Code and those sort of things with just regular chat. I started playing around with having like a .notes folder where I would tell the LLM to just, you're working on this project, but here's a folder for you to just dump whatever you want in there. And then, somewhat out of curiosity to see what it would put in there. But also so it could have a place to sort of remember things about my project or or anything that it might need for like scratch notes if it's doing research. And I actually saw some improvements with that. And then as I moved on to playing with agents and specifically like kind of running my own orchestration and kind of going deep into that rabbit hole of sort of having your own orchestrator and having these things sort of run in a loop, I sort of went back to this idea of having markdown based memory, and having the agent sort of learn about the project it's working around, learn about its surroundings, learn about its mistakes. But as I started to learn more about memory, I sort of took a step back and said, memory is great, but it's not a silver bullet for everything. And there's a lot of things that are built into the harnesses that we use or that are merging out of some of these new systems that we can take advantage of, without having to build our own memory systems or without having to use memory and kind of waiting for the agents to improve over time. The other thing I'll mention is that Brady Gaster's squad, I mentioned them in the last video. They also have sort of markdown based memory. It's very cool. They like spit out logs and you process them and they kind of move into like different parts of memory. It is definitely like a cool approach to things. But I specifically want to talk to you about some other ways to do memory or other ways to utilize things that maybe we don't call memory that are memory. So one of the reasons you want to have memory is because you want to learn from your mistakes, or you want your agent to learn from your mistakes. And sometimes you can just sort of anticipate what those mistakes might be, or you just sort of notice them as the human who's observing the agent, and you might put that into something like a skill or an instructions file. But you may notice over time, or maybe you don't even realize over time, that the agent is making mistakes, or that you're making mistakes when working with the agent. There's actually a form of memory that we don't think of as being memory in your Copilot sessions, which is the session data itself. And that's actually kind of a treasure trove of sort of things that the agent's done, its notes, its past conversations. And when I say the agent, I also mean the Copilot CLI harness with the general agent. I kind of use those interchangeably. But just sort of recognizing that there is sort of memory already built in to many of the harnesses that we're using, especially GitHub Copilot and especially Copilot CLI. And you can even just ask Copilot to sort of look through its session data and tell you some things about it. But the Copilot CLI team has added this cool feature called Chronicle. And there's a couple different commands for Chronicle. There's stand up, tips, improve, and I actually haven't played around with reindex. That's an interesting one that probably goes back through and sort of reindexes some of the session data. And so stand up and tips. Stand up is obviously going to give you sort of a summary of what you've done. Tips is going to be ways for you to improve, but the one specifically I want to talk to you guys about today is the improve feature. And what improve is going to do, and there's probably not enough sessions in this particular repository for this to actually do anything meaningful, but what it'll do is it'll look through your sessions and adjust your Copilot instructions files to try to make your interactions with Copilot better. So it'll actually see where you've made some mistakes or where Copilot has made some mistakes and add that to your instructions files so that it can be better the next time around, and that you can benefit that from your later sessions, which is just a super cool feature, and also just a really clever way to use session data as memory, and especially when you think of memory in the lens of we want to learn from our mistakes or we want to not repeat our mistakes. There's definitely other reasons to have memory, and all those are good and cool, but I want to kind of bring that up in this context. So I'm just going to go ahead and run Chronicle improve. And we could even look and see while that's running, we can look and see what it created in the Copilot instructions file. So let's just go ahead and open up this folder here. VS Code. Yes, I trust the authors. Yeah, so again, it tried to scan this empty repository and was like, hey, there's nothing here. I can't do anything. And so, the Chronicle improve is probably not going to do much here, but if I maybe started the project, I could run Chronicle improve and it would say, oh, well, actually now we have some things to work with and we want to adjust this instructions file. Yeah. So without, going too deep into a specific project, and I don't like these videos to get too long, I think I'm going to leave you there. Try out Chronicle. It's really cool. It definitely helps with your improve your instructions files. Instruction files are really powerful customizations. Again, you can use them for sort of your personal customizations or your repository customizations. We use them to point to our documentation so the agents can find them more easily. It can sort of navigate our project more efficiently. And if you just use it for that, that's great because you have documentation in your project. So you don't have to go crazy with these things to get a lot of good use out of them. That's kind of what I want to leave you with. Happy vibe coding, and have a good rest of your week.